So, author, Christoph Lisek, 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President, Madam Commissioner. The situation in Iraq for the past decades has always been very complicated. Many conflicts, external and internal. However, I think that the resolution we are putting forward is focusing on all the most important aspects of what goes on in Iraq. Unfortunately, human rights abuses, torture and terrorist attacks are still daily. Our resolution appeals for non-discrimination of Turkmens. The constitution says that everyone is equal, so no discrimination. However, this is still not the case. The Iraqi authorities should coordinate with international organizations all the efforts to secure the situation of those who are most in need. We do hope that Madam Ashton, on behalf of the EU, is going to make every effort to stop discrimination of minorities, and she will support the government in order to organize free and fair regional elections scheduled for April, which will be a chance for a real dialogue.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Lisek.
Thank you, Mr. Lisek. Mr. Repo.
Arvoisa puhemies, Irakissa on useita vähemmistöjä.
In Iraq, there are several minority groups, and the national and international commitments towards them are not respected. In January, just a few months ago, we adopted a partnership agreement with Iraq, and we're already seeing problems in Iraq. Currently, Iraq is governed by several coalitions. There are several ethnic groups in Iraq, and they've historically produced a precious contribution for the world. Iraq needs to ensure that there are guarantees for the Chaldeans, Shebaks, Mandians, Syrians and Turkmen, and all the other groups as well. They need to be treated equally. The European Union needs to support Iraq in its work to improve conditions for these groups in education, working life reforms, etc. These are all very important steps to develop Iraqi society. People in minorities need to be able to exercise their proper culture. Women, almost half of the population, are to the margins of decision-making processes, and that's no good.
Thank you, Ms. Lochbihler. 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, President. 10 years after the end of the repressive regime of Saddam Hussein's, the Iraqis enjoy more freedom, but we see serious human rights violations such as torture and attacks on civilians still continuing. Torture is widespread and is used against those prisoners who have been arrested on suspicions of terrorism. Very often these prisoners are sentenced to death. With 129 sentences executed in recent years, Iraq is top of the list of countries carrying out these executions. There has been a reform process that has been started, and the EU should monitor this closely. At the end of January, the UN Secretary General said that the latest wave of terrorist attacks in Iraq should be condemned, and the EU High Representative did the same. The Iraq government and the regional government of Kurdistan should be called on to de-escalate the situation and to resolve their territorial conflict politically. The Turkmen minority in Iraq is suffering greatly because of this situation. They are subject to assimilation measures, they were abducted and attacked, even though the Iraqi constitution guarantees them the same rights. We, therefore, call that there be negotiations with the Iraqi government and for there to be a particular focus on the status of the Turkmen minority.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin Lochbihler.
Thank you, Mrs. Lochbihler. Mr. Stevenson, 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Last night, Hamid Rabi, a 52-year-old political refugee with permanent residency in Germany, died of injuries sustained in the vicious rocket attack which took place on the 9th of February in Camp Liberty in Baghdad. He was the 8th victim to die as a result of that cowardly assault. Another 10 were dismembered, over 90 were seriously injured. All of us in this chamber are responsible for those deaths and injuries. The EU, UN and US bullied and cajoled the 3,100 Iranian asylum seekers and refugees to abandon their relative safety of Camp Ashraf and move to the prison-like conditions of Camp Liberty. We guaranteed their safety and we deceived them. We sent them to a death camp. The 3,100 defenceless refugees are now crushed into a compound of only half a square kilometre in size, forced to live in squalid and unsanitary conditions, in flimsy caravans. They were sitting ducks when 45 rockets were fired in a tight trajectory during the hours of darkness, hitting the area where the maximum number of people were sleeping. This was no random terrorist attack. It was a professionally executed military operation. The rockets were fired from only 3 kilometres distance, well within the military compound that surrounds Camp Liberty. There is no doubt that the operation was ordered by the Iranian regime and was carried out with the close cooperation of the Iraqi government, and it will not be the last attack. And now, although almost 5 weeks have passed since that brutal incident, the Iraqi government has still not allowed body armour or even hard hats into Camp Liberty. They are being set up for annihilation, and we, through our silence and our reluctance to intervene, are complicit in this crime.
Thank you, Mr. Stevenson. Now, Mr. Kazak.
Thank you, President. Dear colleagues, I would urge you all to support the adoption of the emergency resolution on the plight of minority groups in Iraq, in particular the Iraqi Turkmen. Literally hundreds of men, women and children are dying each year in attacks targeted on the Turkmen community, and this tragedy must be stopped. A dreadful example which represents just the tip of the iceberg of the sectarian violence against the Iraqi Turkmen is the horrific and suicide bomb attack that took place on January 23rd of this year at the funeral of a Turkmen civil servant in Tuzhurmati, who himself had been assassinated the previous day. This attack claimed the life of a further 42 ethnic Turkmen and wounded another 117. Despite the findings of Iraqi's own High Commission for Human Rights, which acknowledge that Turkmen have been subjected to terrorism, bombings, kidnappings and assassination, neither the federal government of Iraq nor the Kurdish regional government have done enough to provide security and protection for all Iraqi citizens in general and the Turkmen in particular, because they have been numerously targeted on a larger scale. This resolution is not just for the Turkmen too. It is for all the minority communities of Iraq who long for peace and security. Therefore, the EU should work closely with the Iraqi government and use all the tools at its disposal to encourage the Iraqi government to provide adequate protection to the Turkmen and other minorities. Lastly, I would like to thank all political groups for their support in putting such an important resolution before the plenary, and urge you once again for the adoption, because Europe has to demonstrate that it has not forgotten the Turkmen community and other Iraqi minorities, and that we will endeavour to ease their suffering. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kazak. Now, Mrs. Vergiat for 1.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. 10 years after the non-UN mandated intervention in Iraq carried out by the US and UK allies, I think the least we can say is that we can really wonder about the effectiveness of this intervention. Amnesty International has just published its yearly report on the situation of human rights in the world, and the part on Iraq makes terrible reading, including the role of US security forces in Iraq until the end of 2011 when they were present in Iraq. UN reports have also denounced human rights violations carried out by private security and military companies that were allowed in by the coalition forces. They enjoy almost full impunity. Over 12,000 people are currently incarcerated and haven't been tried in Iraq. Popular demonstrations are severely repressed and many people were killed during a recent demonstration in Baghdad in February, and minorities are the main victims. The situation of the Turkmen is a sad picture of how terrible the situation is. Their identity has been denied since the end of the First World War and still is. They're unfortunate enough to mainly live in one of the areas that is most prized in Iraq. The situation today really is not good. The resolution doesn't really reflect the situation properly, but we will be voting in favour of it nonetheless because it reflects the positions of all stakeholders, and we think that's essential. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Vergia. Now, the speakers on behalf of the groups, starting with Mr. Posselt for 1 minute.
Herr Präsident.
Thank you, President. Next year, it's 95 years since the Paris treaties. We've tried not just to rebuild Europe, but the Middle East. There's a Serb agreement where we said that the Kurds would get self-determination, and then there was Lausanne. Now, this artificial state came out of the bits left of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. So people just dividing and ruling and sort of inciting peoples against peoples. And now, unfortunately, you can say the government in Iraq can't bring together Sunnis and Shiites and Kurds. The whole smaller groups, the Christians who live in Nineveh and the Turkmens, Turkmen who come from the remnants of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, they can't get their rights. They're trying to fight the big groupings. There's people trying to grab raw materials, and it's a very cynical exercise. So we've got to tell the government to make sure they respect individual human rights.
Thank you, Mrs. Oyuland.
President, I would like to convey our sincerest condolences to the Iraqi Turkmen families who lost their loved ones in the horrific attacks that have taken place in recent months. Despite promising to protect the rights of Turkmen and other minorities, Iraq didn't do so. Iraq was last year rated as the fourth most dangerous country in the world for minorities. The Iraqi government must immediately implement and guarantee fundamental human rights for all ethnic and religious communities by strengthening its democratic institutions and the rule of law. Work needs to proceed to the national reconciliation of an extremely fragmented society. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Oyuland. Now for 1 minute, Mr. Tannock.
10 years after the Allied military intervention, the Iraqi people sadly continue to be victims of violence and disorder on a depressingly regular basis. The recent massacres of Turkmen and Kurdish citizens demonstrate the deeply troubling extent of the problem, far beyond the simple Sunni-Shia fault lines. I, for instance, for many years have expressed my concerns about Christian minorities in the country, in particular the Assyrians, who continue to suffer systematic oppression. Iraq was not a nation-state based around any one ethnicity, and the multiple cultural, national and religious identities of its citizens could, in principle, be a source of strength in its diversity. We must therefore in this House take the opportunity to ask the federal government to do all it can to help minority groups. The new High Commission for Human Rights is a positive step, and of course we must commend the Kurdish regional government in particular, which must be allowed maximum autonomy for what it does to try and help. Above all, the Baghdadi government must treat human rights as its guiding principle and of course must afford much better security for all the minorities of this country. We in the EU must stand ready to assist our Iraqi partners wherever we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tannock. Now for 1.5 minutes, Mr. Paška.
Ďakujem za slovo, vážený pán predsedajúci, vážená pani komisárka.
Thank you, Madam Commissioner. One of the most explosive areas since the fall of Saddam Hussein is Kirkuk, because of the oil resources. There are different groups fighting over this region. Under Saddam Hussein, thousands of Kurds were driven out of the city and their place was taken by Arabs. Now the Kurds have come back and are driving out the Arabs and the Turkmens. Kurdish autonomy is attempting to gain control of this area, perhaps also because of the natural resources there. The violence and political assassinations are an instrument that is being used to gain power. And because we are talking here about oil resources, I think we should not be under any illusions about what the background to this violence is. Quite clearly, we are talking about the interests of the big oil companies. The Iraqi administration cannot prevent this conflict between the different religious and ethnic groups. In battles around Kirkuk, there is too much violence being used, and perhaps in trying to resolve this problem we should try not just to appeal to the Iraqi government but also to the Kurdish and autonomous administration, so that the inhabitants do not become victims of the battles in this region. Thank you, Mr. Pashka. That finishes the speakers for the groups. The other speakers, first of all, Mr. Sarvamaa.
10 years after the war on Saddam Hussein, we are unfortunately witnessing Iraq that is as insecure and brutal to live for its minorities as it ever was. The recent wave of terrorist attacks and outright executions in Iraq has again killed hundreds of people. It seems that especially minorities are in gravest danger. Honourary Chair, while this resolution there is no mentioning of Camp Liberty, it is my moral duty to mention those over 3,000 people who live in unhuman conditions just kilometres away from the government of Iraq and the diplomatic compounds of the rest of the world. They also are a minority in Iraq. They are Iranian refugees with no status and no security. The state of Iraq is not doing enough to protect these unarmed civilians. Just last night there was another victim in Camp Liberty as Mr. Hamid Rabi died of his wounds of the missile.
Thank you, Mr. Sarvamaa. Now Mr. Sonik for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. We must not remain passive in front of what is happening in Iraq. The dispute between the central Baghdad government and the regional Kurdistan government is acute and is a threat to the peaceful coexistence of the many groups in Iraq, the Kurds, the Arabs and the Turkmen. We are witnessing a growing number of suicide attacks and terrorist attacks, which is what happened when a Kurdish official was being buried in December. This illustrates the scale of violence in the country. The violence is aimed against civil population and also arises from religious or ethnic-based prejudice. The Middle East is a clearly visible system of interconnected bodies. What happens in the region at large will have a bearing on what is going on in Iraq. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sonik. So that brings us to the end of the speakers list. On to Catch the Eye. We are short for time, so I will apply the same procedure as before. Mrs. Essayah, first of all.
Irakin turkmenit ovat kolmanneksi isoin etninen vähemmistö ja elävät
Thank you. talking about the Kurds are the third largest minority in population in Iraq and in the north, and a lot of them live around Kirkuk. And a lot of people have been trying to use the Turkmen for their own political purposes and force them to renounce their culture in Kirkuk. This has given rise to all sorts of problems for the minorities. They are in an unstable situation in Iraq. So it is time that you consult these minority groups and show that we can support them directly to get stable structures. The international community must appeal to the current government to make sure that they do that.
Thank you, Mr. Isaiah. Now, Mr. Kutash.
Mulțumesc, domnule președinte. Am luat cunoștință cu părere de rău.
Thank you, President. I became aware of this attack that took place on the 23rd of January against the Turkmen population in Iraq. The Turkmen population is extremely vulnerable in Iraq. There are murders, kidnappings, and they take place very regularly. That's why it's extremely important that the Iraqi parliament establishes this High Commission for Human Rights. The country needs to make every effort to ensure that minorities are protected and that they are free to exercise their rights. Maintaining security and public order also need to be priorities for the government. The European Union has a duty to support Iraq. Cooperation could be a platform for dialogue and could be a way of supporting Iraq when it comes to rights and fundamental liberties. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kutash. That ends the Catch the Eye procedure. I'll give the floor to the Commissioner, Mrs. Damanaki.
Thank you, President. Dear members of the Parliament, we share the concerns you have about the situation of Iraqi minorities. We are all aware, of course, of the difficult situation in Iraq, across Iraq, and the impact they have on the life of Iraq's people, and in particular the minorities, including Turkmen, who are more vulnerable. You are well aware of the emphasis that the European Union puts on human rights in its external action. And it's true that the situation in Iraq raises indeed serious concern. Cathy Ashton has regularly condemned the continuing unacceptable violence in Iraq, including attacks against minorities. She also repeatedly called publicly on the government and Iraq's major political forces to engage in a dialogue to address the pending issues and ensuring effective governance and rule of law in all the Iraq. This is all the more important now that the country is facing serious political difficulties with increased tensions along ethno-sectarian lines. In this respect, the European Union supports the work of the United Nations in facilitating dialogue between the major political forces. In its dialogue with Iraq, the European Union does not hesitate to voice its concerns over human rights, including in particular freedom of religion or belief and elimination of all forms of discrimination. The European Union has offered to cooperate with Iraq in improving human rights protection. A lot of you mentioned a new European Union-Iraq Partnership and Cooperation Agreement. In this agreement, human rights are a prominent element and one of the agreed priorities for implementation. It will certainly contribute to increase the scope for this cooperation. The European Union will keep its targeted support to Iraq. Since 2004, the European Union has contributed over €1 billion to Iraq, ranging from humanitarian aid and support to basic services to promoting democracy, human rights and the rule of law. Part of this contribution has supported the most vulnerable Iraqis and the minorities. I can refer, for example, to activities in the field of water, education or health in areas as Kirkuk, Suleimaniya, Erbil, which are parts of the effort to assist the government in the provision of basic services. Capacity building, for example, to Iraq's judicial system, including the Center of Torture Victims in Kirkuk and the Council of Representatives, where minorities are represented, has also been a part of our commitments. All this in areas where the presence of minorities is particularly significant. What we hear from all minorities is that they don't want to leave Iraq. We take good note of their views that this rich mosaic of ethnic, religions, linguistic and cultural backgrounds of the people in Iraq is a valuable heritage to be cherished and protected. So the European Union is committed to follow closely the human rights issues in relation to minorities and other vulnerable groups in Iraq. Thank you, President.
Thank you, Commissioner Damanaki. To conclude the debate, 6 motions for resolutions have been submitted. That completes the debate, and the vote will take place at the end of today's debates. Next item on the agenda is the case of